Hello, everyone, and good evening. Welcome to the Secret Science Club. Online, I'm Dorian Devons.
And I am Margaret Middlebach. Welcome, everybody.
Welcome. For those of you who are Secret Science Club regulars, welcome back. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, Secret Science Club is a public lecture, arts, and performance series featuring scientists who study everything from black holes to the human brain. Our live events have been going on for more than 17 years in New York City. We're now online with expanded audience reach and more frequent events. Tonight, we're proud to present the Dana Foundation Neuroscience and Society Lecture in honor of Brain Awareness Week, featuring Francis X. Shen and Adriana Galván. This event is supported by the Dana Foundation as part of its Dana Education Program, which includes the coordination of Brain Awareness Week. The Dana Foundation is dedicated to advancing neuroscience and society by supporting cross-disciplinary intersections, such as neuroscience and ethics, law, policy, humanities, and the arts. We're very happy to be working with them again and to join them in promoting and celebrating Brain Awareness Week. And now it's our pleasure to introduce the director of the Dana Education Program, Kathleen Roina.
Thank you for the introduction, Dorian. Happy Brain Awareness Week, everyone, and welcome to tonight's wonderful program. The Dana Foundation's mission is to advance neuroscience that benefits society and reflects the aspirations of all people. We explore the connections between neuroscience and society's challenges and opportunities, working to maximize the potential of the field to do good. Brain Awareness Week has been a signature education initiative of the Foundation since 1996. For those who may be unfamiliar with Brain Awareness Week, it's an annual campaign to foster public enthusiasm and support for brain science. There are events taking place all over the world this week and beyond, which you can look up on our website, brainawareness.org. One of the goals of Brain Awareness Week is to bring neuroscience programming to local public communities, to share fascinating science, but also to relate it to our everyday lives. Tonight's program on the brain and law is a prime example of just that. In this case, through its focus on how discoveries about the adolescent brain are influencing law and policy. We are so grateful to our two fabulous speakers tonight. So without further ado, I will introduce them and pass the mic, so to speak. Our first speaker, Dr. Adriana Galván, is a professor of psychology and dean of undergraduate education at the University of California, Los Angeles. An expert on the adolescent brain and the author of over 100 scientific papers, Dr. Galván has made seminal discoveries about brain development in children, teens, and adults. Her research on the adolescent brain has played a central role in landmark Supreme Court decisions regarding the culpability and punishment of juvenile offenders. Dr. Francis Shen is a professor at Harvard Medical School's Center for Bioethics and an affiliated faculty member at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Shen is a pioneer in establishing the interdisciplinary field of law and neuroscience and conducts research on how insights from neuroscience and artificial intelligence can make the legal system more just and effective. He is the director of Harvard's Shen Lab, Law, Ethics, Neuroscience, and Artificial Intelligence, where the motto is, every story is a brain story. I'll now turn things over to Dr. Galván to begin our program.
Thank you, Kathleen. This is such a nice introduction, and I'm so excited to be a part of the conversation today, and in particular with Francis, who, as you know, and you mentioned, has contributed so greatly to the understanding of brain and neuroscience. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. All right, let's see. Okay, so I'm going to give a brief overview of what neuroscience has revealed about the adolescent brain and behavior. And I'll cut to the chase, and the answer is a lot. We've learned a lot about how the brain changes during adolescence through neuroscience methods and how that has implications for policy. The most important thing to know is that adolescent brain development is necessary to support key developmental outcomes. And that means that we need the brain to change during adolescence so that adolescents become good social partners, that they become independent, that they start to care about the world outside of themselves and explore and seek out novelty. All of those things are necessary for our species to survive and for people who are in the adolescent phase of life to transition into the adult phase of life. A lot of this work was initially fueled by the interest in understanding why teenagers act crazy, as you see in this headline here, or the terrible teens. And these articles were written in the 2014 and 2015. And luckily, the narrative has shifted a little bit about understanding adolescence and recognizing that the changes in adolescent brain development are attributes and necessary parts of development. And there's been a refreshing narrative shift about teenagers. This snapshot you see on the right is taken from the journal Nature, which published a series of articles in 2018, recognizing that adolescents research needs to grow up, that we need to pay more attention, that we need to recognize the attributes of adolescence, and that we need to appreciate how the normative changes that happen actually support all of us, not just adolescents, but all of us as adults, into becoming functioning adults in society. I've used this word a lot, adolescence. And what I mean by that is the period of life that encompasses roughly around age 10, when puberty strikes, through the mid-20s, when we think the brain stops developing, maybe I shall say, and starts aging. And during this time, we discover, we learn from, we adapt to the world around us. And in this image that you're seeing here, I highlight that adolescence spans this over about a decade of time, but also that there are nuances and differences and different stages during this period of time. So a 10-year-old is obviously quite different from a 20-year-old. But generally, we think about all of these people in this age range as transitioning into adulthood from childhood. They are informed by different pubertal hormones. They are informed by different stages in brain development. And obviously, the context is changing during this time as well. I'll synthesize some research that we've learned in the past 10 or 20 years about the adolescent brain. But before I do, I want to offer some caveats and considerations as we think about what these data mean and how research has informed policy. The first is that there's extensive variation. All of these studies generally group together people between the ages of, let's say, 12 to 18. But there are individual differences. We all come to the world with our own history and our own biology. And that informs the variation we see, particularly during adolescence, when people achieve developmental milestones at different times. So this picture that you're seeing here is representative of a group of people who are all 14 years old, and they are all 8th graders. But if you take a close look at what you see, some kids look like, the boy down here, a little in the lower right, looks a little bit younger than what we might think of as a typical teenager, whereas the one right next to him looks maybe like he's in high school, but they're all 14 and 8th grade. And so that's just a reminder of the fact that even though we group people together, they all have unique experiences. The second caveat I want to remind us about is that adolescence itself is changing, and the things that adolescents do, or what characterizes adolescence in this country, changes across generations. This figure now is a few years old, but it represents data from over 8.3 million adolescents, data taken from the mid-70s until 2014. And it was simply a study that asked how the level to which adolescents endorsed these behaviors. Have you ever had a driver's license? Have you tried alcohol? Have you dated? Have you worked for pay? In the mid-70s, the answer to this was yes, hovering around 85 to 90% of adolescents endorsing these behaviors. But you can see that there was a precipitous drop in the late 90s about things we think adolescents do. There's many fewer adolescents obtaining a driver's license or having alcohol or dating. And some might say that this coincides with the uptick in social media use. Who knows what the actual cause is, but it's just a reminder that how we think about adolescence changes and adolescents transform throughout history. And the last thing I'll say is that the data we have about adolescent neuroscience is focused on Western countries. So 25% of the world's population is between the ages of 10 and 24. And yet, and 9/10 live in low and middle income countries. And yet 90% of our data come from high income countries. And so we are not doing the best job at representing adolescents from all over the world, but the field is changing, and we aim to get more information that is representative of all adolescents. There are a lot of changes that happen during adolescence that influence behavior that we care about in conversation about the law and policy. One is that puberty triggers a lot of the social and biological changes that we observe. And this picture that you're seeing on the right is representing where every place in the body that adolescence hits. It starts in the brain, and it triggers, it trickles down into different parts of the body. Relationships continue to expand. So we grow our social network, not beyond the family, beyond the parent relationship. And that's very normative for adolescents to seek out interests and information from people of their own age group. Central to adolescent development is autonomy and socially integrating into society, into our school, into our community. Adolescents start to think more about identity formation, and this has a lot to do with increases in interest from brain regions that help us think about who we are and who we are relative to other people. There are changes in sleep hygiene that I'll mention. And finally, neuroplasticity leads to increased sensitivity to the environment. That simply means that your brain isn't expanding in size. We don't have a much larger physical footprint in our brain, but what changes is how our brain responds to the environment and how the brain responds to itself and the connections that are formed. I'll highlight two major neurodevelopmental milestones that occur during adolescence. The first is focused on what's called the frontomesolimbic circuitry. And obviously that's jargon and neuroscience jargon, but it basically means that brain regions that are focused in the prefrontal cortex, the front of your brain, and brain regions that are sensitive to reward and risk-taking and emotion are all undergoing change. During adolescence, your brain isn't changing so much in brain regions that support language development, for example, that happens earlier in life, or brain regions that support motor development that also happens earlier in life, but instead is changing in brain regions that support thinking about the future or reading the emotional expression of someone else, or noticing what you find rewarding. Those are the brain regions that change during adolescence. The other thing that happens is that there is a strengthening of neural connections. And so the front of your brain is doing a better job at talking to the emotional parts of your brain. And so that helps us establish good emotion regulation or impulse control. That is all occurring during adolescence. And sometimes as parents, I'm a parent myself of a preteen, we see that they're working it out, that the brain is really making sense of the world in terms of how to regulate our emotions or to react to other people. And that is all occurring because of the changes that I'm highlighting here. All of this relates to policy because policy is specifically related to young people or adolescents, is focused on understanding how we can optimize conditions for young people or support them in times of struggle or situations like that. And I'll highlight three things that are implicated in neuroscience as relevant for policy. One is that recognizing that adolescence is a distinct developmental stage did not come without a lot of research. When I started doing this work, there was a lot of focus on earlier brain development and understanding how the early child or the infant learned how to bond with caregivers, how to talk and how to walk, and how all of those things were informed by context. And now we recognize that adolescence is also a special phase in life that we need to pay attention to. The second is that neuroplasticity that I mentioned before, whereby the brain is more sensitive to the environment, means that there's possibility for input, there's possibility for intervention, and there's possibility for change. And all of that is particularly relevant for the law as related to adolescence. And finally, I'll offer just a few brief comments about how it might relate to driving, teenage driving and sleep. So adolescence as a distinct neurodevelopmental stage means that the prefrontal cortex becomes more efficient during this time, that the reward systems are more active, and that the brain is uniquely skilled at exploratory behavior and flexible learning. This image that you're seeing here is representative of just the connections and the many connections that occur during adolescence, and that helps us become more efficient at processing information. And I'm going to jump through some slides just so I can get to Francis, and I know he has some great remarks to share as well, that motivation and reward systems are more active during adolescence, and this means that in response to the same reward, adolescents show a greater amount of activation in the brain compared to children and adults. And this has been related to real life risk-taking behavior. So individuals who show more activation in the brain when they are confronted with a reward or presented with a reward are also coincidentally the ones who show greater risk-taking behavior. And this was used to suggest that, to kind of make the point that adolescents were having behavioral problems because their brain was somehow broken or too reactive to rewards in the environment. But I want to underscore the fact that this doesn't suggest that. In fact, we know from a lot of newer research that the same brain regions that code reward are also the ones that are helping us learn about the environment. And so that is one attribute of adolescence that is often missed or not represented. And so I think actually maybe I'll stop there. I have so much more to talk about, and I want to talk a little bit about sleep, but I know that I'm running short on time and I want to give time for Francis. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Francis Shen, and let him give his remarks, and then we'll come back to our conversation.
That was great. We should definitely get to sleep.
I care a lot about sleep.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about. So thank you, first of all, to the Dana Foundation, to the Secret Science Club for having us. It's a pleasure to be with you. And my goal is to give you an overview of adolescent brain science and the criminal law, and two challenges in particular: the challenge of line drawing in the law and the challenge of individualization. And Dr. Galván has already set up both of those really well. I'll also give you kind of just an overview of this new field that you've probably never heard of called law in neuroscience, and hopefully get you a little excited about it. I have no disclosures. I want to thank all the people who support our work in our lab, including the Dana Foundation. So I'll give you a punchline, a little intro to my work, very, very brief history of neuroscience and law. I'll talk about the Supreme Court and the adolescent brain and a series of cases that have been really important, and leave you with some questions about where this is all headed in the future of neuroscience and society. So to get us started, here's the punchline. Adolescent and developmental neuroscience is showing up more and more in the law. In fact, I could spend the next hour just showing you case after case after case after case where lawyers and judges are dealing with the sorts of science that Dr. Galván was just discussing. That wasn't the case 20 years ago. We're in a new era. But here's the question that I want to pose to you and think about. Should the criminal law draw a line between juvenile and adult? Many of you might say yes, but then where? And what role does neuroscience play in that line drawing? So I start every talk I give with the challenge. I say to myself, all right, can I find a headline that I've never seen before, like in the last week, the last month? And it always happens because this field is so dynamic. So this was just from March 10th from the Baltimore Banner. And this is written an op-ed by a defense attorney and no longer a young man, but then a young man, Amin Saeed, who was convicted. His conviction was eventually overturned by the court. But in their op-ed, they talk about the role of neuroscience and adolescent brain development in their argument that says we should not be trying children in adult courts. But of course, the headline and the op-ed raises the question, all right, whenever would you have children in a court? When does a child become an adult? And I'm going to give you a little ancient philosophy to go with that news headline. Sorites, about 2,000 years ago, Sorites meaning heap. Sorites paradox is, when does a heap of sand become a non-heap? We know that one grain of sand is not a heap of sand. This is a heap of sand. So you take one grain off. Okay, still a heap. Another one, still a heap, right? When does a heap of sand not become a heap of sand? When does a child become an adult? And what does that have to do with the law? All right, that's my challenge to cover with you tonight. A little bit of introduction to the work we do. I direct the lab. Our motto is every story is a brain story, but two really important caveats. One, every story is not a fully understood brain story. That turns out to have major implications for the law. And two, every story is not just a biology story. It's a story of culture and context and history and philosophy and environment and a whole bunch of other things. We look at two questions. This is the first one I'll talk about tonight. How do advances like those in adolescent neuroscience inform the law? The other stuff we do is looking at how law might shape neuroscience research and a lot of ethical questions along the way. We do kind of empirical and theoretical research. We do outreach. We have all kinds of team members. So thanks to all of them for joining. I joke that when I travel, I don't pick up souvenirs. I pick up co-authors. So watch out. Maybe you'll join us. We publish on a lot of things, none of which I'll talk about tonight. If you want to learn more, a couple of sites, and I'll share these slides afterwards. If there's a website, lawneuro.org, the home of the MacArthur Foundation Research Network on law and neuroscience, where Dr. Galván and I first actually connected through them. And I'll talk about the work of a center called the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior, who is doing applied work in adolescent brain science and the law. And the thought there is that better decisions aligned with science can produce better outcomes in line with justice. I serve as the Chief Innovation Officer, along with Judy Edersheim, Bruce Price, Robert Pinchriff, and others. We work in that center. I'll talk about our work. Okay, so a little context and history of neuroscience and the law. There's been some good, some really good, some bad, and some really bad. And I'll just mention kind of one of the cautionary tales. So in general, this is from Paul Root-Wolpe, has said that history has shown us the repeated policy failures of a biologically based approach to criminal justice. And I think this challenge is, do we learn from this history? And here's one piece of it. For many years, scientists have tried to find and cure, and I put those in quotes, the so-called violent brain. I won't talk about the two most recent iterations in the interest of time, but I'll take us back to this commemorative stamp. You might not be able to see it well on your screen, but that is a commemorative stamp for Igor Moniz, who won a Nobel Prize for the prefrontal lobotomy. And that's the tool. Now, you know that tool, and you're probably going, oh, no, not lobotomies. What you might not know is that at its time, conversations like this, though without the PowerPoint and the Zoom, it was thought to be maybe a really important thing for the criminal law. Here's a quote from the Yale Law Journal. Perfection of so relatively simple and inexpensive a rehabilitative technique as the prefrontal lobotomy promises to be a major contribution to the cure of criminals. Now, thankfully, it wasn't ever used widespread. A couple instances it was, but it just raises the question of, in the law, when do we know enough? Dr. Galván started, and really importantly, talking about all the research we know about the adolescent brain. But in law, we've got to be cautious to say, well, do we know enough for a particular legal purpose? I can tell you that the law is really interested now in law and neuroscience. It wasn't 12 years ago when I began my career. We tried to get our book published, and the reviewer said, most professors are left wondering what, if anything, neuroscience can ever say that's truly useful to the law. The topics are so hypothetical and conjectural that most law students would find the course impractical. Who would want law and neuroscience? Thankfully, somebody did. We published our book. We published the second edition. About 50% of the stuff is new. These things are happening quick. Here are just 3 graphs to show you more cases, more scholarship, more state policy. I don't know if we'll have time to talk about it tonight, but adolescent brain science isn't just showing up in the courts, it's showing up in state legislatures and Congress as well. We track these sorts of cases, and the reason there are so many is that it's kind of trite, but it's true. A lot in the law hinges on how brains work. So what was once a philosophical inquiry, such as, did my neurons make me do it, is now actual legal practice. My brain made me do it is becoming a more common criminal defense. And in particular, the utilization of adolescent brain science is showing up in a lot of both state and federal legal context. And I'll talk about just a couple of these key Supreme Court cases that bring to bear some of the foundational and most difficult questions. There have been a lot of Supreme Court cases dealing with adolescent brain science since 2005. The big one was Roper v. Simmons, in which the court said under the 8th Amendment and its cruel and unusual, the prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, it is cruel and unusual to have the death penalty for a minor. Where did they draw the line? At age 18. They then said it's also cruel and unusual to have a life without parole for non-homicide offenders, and cruel and unusual to have mandatory life without parole even for homicide offenders. It was made retroactive, and most recently some procedural questions. I'm going to focus on that first case, Roper v. Simmons. Now, this is a picture of Mr. Simmons, Christopher Simmons, and this is a picture of his victim, Shirley Crook. And I put that victim photo there because this is not an Innocence Project case. This is a guilty project case. The facts of this case are horrible. Mr. Simmons, at age 17, committed murder. It was absolutely, he admitted to it. And it wasn't just a sort of wham, bam, bam, it was planned. So Simmons actually said to his friends, I want to murder someone. He talked about his plan. His plan was to commit burglary, tie someone up, and throw them off a bridge. And he even told his friends, we can get away with it because we're minors. That is exactly what they did with two colleagues, also young. They broke into Mrs. Crook's home, tied her up, duct taped her, took her, this is my home state of Missouri, to the Merrimack River, dropped her over into the water where she died in the cold waters below. And the question was, he was immediately found guilty and sentenced to death in Missouri. And the question was, because of his age, is there a categorical prohibition on the death penalty for someone in his position, even someone with those facts? This case went up to the Supreme Court, and I want to share with you, hopefully the audio will work, which I'll share with audio here, the audio of just part of the oral argument. This is a defense, the attorney responding for the government, arguing that, yes, the death penalty should be allowed. And they're going to talk about adolescence and line drawing. See what you think.
There's no study in anything that Mr. Simmons cites that justifies that particular day, 18. They talk about adolescence, they talk about young adolescents, old adolescents, they talk about adolescence continuing until the mid-20s. Nothing justifies the age of 18. That makes it the kind of fact that a legislature ought to be evaluating, not a court.
Is adolescence, as a scientific term, does it always occur on the same day for all individuals?
No, the studies point out that adolescence is, well, they don't agree on what adolescence means, and they point out that it begins and ends on different times for different people. So we don't know what adolescence means in the studies, and we don't know what it would mean were the court to base a decision on this concept of adolescence.
All right, so you see there this line drawing challenge, and that sticks with us. The other challenge that emerged in that case that remains with us is this challenge of individualization. And that is, in the graphs that Dr. Galván shows, it shows difference between adolescent behavior and brain states as compared to groups on either side. Within, and this is, you just talked about, there's a lot of individual variation within the group. And the dissent in Roper picked up on that. Justice O'Connor wrote, of course, juveniles as a class are generally less mature, less responsible, and so forth. But at most, the court's argument suggests that the average 17-year-old murderer is not as culpable as the average adult murderer. But an especially depraved juvenile offender may nevertheless be just as culpable as many adult offenders. And of course, she had in mind Christopher Simmons and the callous facts I just gave you. So these two tensions, right? There is certainly a difference in groups, but where do you draw that group line? And then within group, there's individual variation. How do you handle that? Well, you can imagine this is the next frontier is getting even more complicated because the line was drawn at 18. And really the next frontier is about, what about a day older than 18? What about a minute older than 18 when all those protections disappear? And that's where a lot of the litigation is now. These are the number of cases being litigated over the last 5 years where individual defendants are saying, hey, I was 18 in just a few days. You're saying that it's cruel and unusual to sentence the 17-year-old and 6 months to punishment, but 18-year-old in 1 day, it's okay. How can you draw that line? And this came up in many cases. One prominent one, as you may recall, it seems almost a long time ago, but back in 2017 in Charlottesville, there were protests of white nationalists and counter-protests. And the defendant drove his car into this crowd, killing Heather Heyer. And in his defense, this is James Fields, age 20 at the time of this incident. In his defense, he argued and led in his brief with this argument. Contemporary neuroscience prove that the constitutionally distinct status of juveniles must extend, here's our line drawing, extend to the age of 21. They cited specifically the work of functional magnetic resonance imaging, the kind of work that many of Dr. Galván's work and colleagues do. In response, the prosecution said, well, no. Field's actions don't fit into that paradigm. He's different. So again, we see this line drawing, this individualization show up. How is this all going to work out? Well, let me just say a few words about the future of neuroscience in society. What does law and neuroscience look like? First of all, I just want to let you know that next time you have us back to talk, we'll talk about 100 other things: lie detection and memory in the law, pain in the law, sleep in the law, educational neuroscience, so much else. But I want to say that really a lot of the future of the work here is around community engagement and thinking about how collectively the science and the community and the justice system can work together. We've been doing this work at Harvard with colleagues. We held a Neurotech Justice Summit. We've been working with a wonderful group on justice in the developing brain called More Than Words with the prosecutor's office, Suffolk County in Boston, with public defenders. We've been working with judges as well. And I'll just leave with a couple of slides about that. We run workshops on science-informed decision-making, and the we being the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior with colleagues at Harvard. We've been running them for a number of years. Judges come, these are federal judges from across the country, so we're kind of spreading the word out. And we talk with them about these issues and bring in experts like Dr. Galván so that judges can have a better understanding of the individuals who are showing up in their courtroom. This is having an impact. Here's one quote from Judge Esther Salas from the U.S. District Court for the District of New Jersey. She said in a talk a few years ago, quote, "I learned about neuroscience, learned about trauma, and we have to understand the individual we are dealing with." And really, I think that's where the brain science is headed, to provide for us general context, which is important, but to go along with individualized tools to unlock the mystery of our brains. And I'll close with this image that I love. It's not mine, so here's the credit at the bottom. But because of this skull, we don't see our brains working, and yet they're just working all the time. In adolescence, before they're picking up everything we put around. And I also think that a lot of the conversations, as I said before, is going to evolve around those inputs, those community inputs that affect and shape brains, and that the law has a lot to say about. Last thing is that if you're a student, get involved. Thank you to the Dana Foundation for supporting a new career network in neuroscience in society, because you will shape the future of this emerging, fast-changing field, so that when I show these slides next month, next year, certainly next decade, they'll look totally different because of all the cool work you do. And I think I'll stop there. So I think we're going to get into conversation, Dr.
Let's do it. Let's do it. How the hell are we going to figure out when someone becomes an adult, right? Because when I serve as an expert witness or provide testimony, that is the number one question. Give me an age, give me a capability, give me a metric by which I know that someone has become an adult and could make decisions, or their sanctions should be based on decisions that they have, that they're capable of.
Well, I thought you were going to tell us the answer. This is, but I have a question. I'll answer your question with the question.
Okay.
One of the proposals that has been floating around is that, okay, look, there's not a single line between childhood and adulthood, but we could we don't have to have just two groups. We could have three groups. We could have juvenile, something like young adult, and then adult. Do you think that's scientifically appropriate? Like, would you like to see that sort of enacted, that we have a young adult court or young adult jurisprudence, like carve out something like 18 to 25? Yeah,
I think that's what we need to do, because they are distinct. And that's what about 20 years of neuroscience has taught us, is that adolescence is a distinct time in development, when the environment is different, what their brain is doing is different, what their hormones are doing is different. And so it's not accurate to think of them as overgrown kids or young, or mini adults. It's really a distinct time in life.
Can I ask you another question too, which I was really glad that you brought up, how the field has sort of shifted from adolescence as a pathology to seeing all the benefits of adolescence. I think in the criminal law, adolescent brain science is generally brought in almost analogous to other mental defects. And in fact, in that litigation, the analogies were to mentally challenged adults, which, there's jurisprudence that says with certain IQ tests and other measures, it's cruel and unusual to sentence to death. Those who basically don't have the intellectual capacity to understand what they did. So how do you feel about that as a scientist who is trying to, as you just said, kind of change the narrative on the research side, and yet it, from a lawyer's perspective who's defending these individuals, it doesn't help them a lot to go into court and say, let me tell you about all the great capabilities that Mr. Simmons had. Like they had to really emphasize, or they've tried to emphasize strategically, impulsiveness, can't control actions, rove around in packs, and I'm wondering how you kind of balance that tension.
Yeah, well, I think it doesn't honor the fact that the plasticity is so important, the capacity for change. So if you think that someone is unable to be emotion regulated, or to make good decisions, or to think about the future, you're already putting them in a category. And when we talk about the law, we need to think about what the sanction will do to their further development. We know that in adolescence, it's so important to get feedback from the environment. And, for better or for worse, the type of feedback we get is going to shape who they are as people. And so if you isolate adolescents into one space, in one context, that may not be the best thing for development.
So let me ask, I'm peppering all these questions, so maybe you should pepper me too, but we didn't get to talk, I didn't go into all the other cases, but one of the other really important cases is this case Miller v. Alabama, where the court says, okay, you can't have, we've already said in Roper, you can't put young murderers to death. Now in Miller, the court says, you can't have mandatory life without the possibility of parole. You've got to do an individualized evaluation. And you, the court, are going to determine whether there is, quote, permanent incorrigibility. Is that such a thing? And can we tell if someone is, what the law was trying to get at, the logic is, look, okay, maybe most are going to get better, but aren't there some just really bad apples and they're evil? And let's separate out kind of the truly evil ones, the permanently incorrigible ones, from the rest. What does the science say about those Miller hearings, that attempt to individualize the assessment at age 17, 18 about permanent incorrigibility?
Well, that's what's so hard. There are no good data to say that I can predict with 100% certainty what this person will be like when they're 40, right? And they're 17 or 18. And I love that you mentioned, what if it's a day later? What if it's 3 days later? What does that matter? And the age of majority is really impactful for these people's outcomes. We're not there. And that's why I think what you said about individualization is so important, because these people are really individuals who come with their own history and who come with their own set of circumstances.
Yeah, I think from the law's perspective, it's really difficult sometimes to know what to do when science, like you said, has learned a lot, but like gets to the water's edge, and judges, they're open to the science, but it's sort of like, we have this experience, it's kind of similar to what you're saying, where our experts come in and they want to know, okay, what do I do? Tell me what's going to happen, give me the prediction with the accurate prediction. But from their point of view, it's tough because there's not an opportunity to sort of just say, well, more research needed, or 78% certainty, right? There are maybe more opportunities for revisiting these sentences. And I think there's certainly, I'm of the view that one of the problems with the really long sentences is you just tie your hand. It's like, you can't renegotiate a contract. Who would sign that long of a deal when it's the uncertainty? You want to have more flexibility. But it is challenging. I think it's also difficult for me, certainly, and for many in the law, to look at the facts of a case like Simmons and see Mr. Simmons as, and so I always read the facts, as anyone but like the worst kind of human being. Because sometimes it's said, well, look, we were all adolescents once, and we did graffiti or took some drugs or even got into fights or something. Yeah. But the facts, that's not even like drive-by shooting facts. Those are the most heinous facts one can imagine. And I think it's really hard, just even emotionally in the law, to see science saying, well, even there, Simmons would never do that again, because the brain that Simmons has 10 years later, 20 years later, is going to be processing information so differently. It's just hard to get over
it's hard to get over that. And you know, the other thing is that we haven't talked at all about equity and bias that happens, right? So Simmons was a particular demographic, and everyone comes with their own history, but that we know impacts outcomes for people, right? Their race, their ethnicity, their socioeconomic status. And so how do we factor that into the predictability of who they will be when they're 20, 30 years down the line as an adolescent, you know, person in the courtroom?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm glad you raised it. We didn't have time to get into it, but we've been studying a lot of this, and I know you're very involved in the ABCD studying, which is they're now amazing new studies. They're trying to diversify who participates in these neuroimaging studies. And the history of the violent brain that I mentioned, there's a wonderful book by Oliver Rollins, sometimes show his some slides, tracing how that pathology was really racialized. So there are some real dangers in sort of introducing a biologically, a neurobiologically based picture of the person to courts, and it can swing both ways. That is, a broken brain, to oversimplify, and especially problematically oversimplify in the case of adolescents, but to play it out, a broken brain can be mitigating, can be like, oh, they couldn't control their action, had a broken brain. It can also be aggravating because the court could say, and the prosecutor could say, it's so broken that this is exactly the sort of thing to fear. And indeed, in this case, the prosecutor made mention of Simmons' age in the end. And here's the quote I always keep. It's like, so this is the prosecutor arguing to the sentencing jury at the end, and said, age, think about age, 17 years old. Isn't that scary? Doesn't that scare you? Mitigating, quite the contrary, I submit. Quite the contrary, right? It's saying, you know, if somebody already at 17 is doing this,
what's going to happen? Yeah.
And just like, what kind of person is it? You know what I mean? Like, I think those facts are so compelling, so difficult. There are so much more and many more sympathetic facts where it's like, why was this person prosecuted even to begin with? But Simmons is tough. To our moderator, should we just, I've got more things to talk about. I don't know if we should take audience questions or
exactly. I see questions.
Otherwise, I lost track of time. We'll just talk the rest of the night.
Well, if you have specific things you would like to ask each other still, there are a few questions, or maybe we can just kind of free form it, and you guys can spring off of some of these questions. I don't know.
We're happy to answer questions.
Yes.
Okay, I have a couple here. One is, in your research on adolescent brains, has there been any work on brain development of early premature babies, 7+ weeks, versus full term? It would seem that the brain development in those situations would be significantly different. And that comes from Dan.
It's such a great question. And this is where we need more research on understanding how early life development impacts the adolescent brain. So we often think about the adolescent brain as developing in a vacuum, but certainly the way that we are reared, the birth experience that we had will impact that. But I don't know of many studies that have actually done that exact examination. Do you, Francis?
No, but I was wondering if you could talk at all, if you know the literature on fetal alcohol syndrome and the brain. It has been litigated a lot, and even up to not just adolescents, but even adults who trace their history of trauma and brain challenges all the way back to fetal alcohol syndrome or other sorts of things that happened to them while they were still in the womb.
Yeah. Well, yes. What I know about it is that certainly fetal alcohol syndrome has implications for later risk-taking behavior or the type of choices that people make when they are adolescents. What's challenging to know is how much that is attributed to the differences in their brain development in utero versus the environment in which they were reared. Because individuals who are born with fetal alcohol syndrome often have parents, obviously, who maybe, have struggles with addiction, et cetera. And so it's hard to know, in this case, environment from, biological influence.
Joanna, was there another question that you wanted us to
Sure, there are a few rolling in here. So here is Mark asking, prosecutors have decided not to indict the first grader who shot his teacher because he would not be able to understand the proceedings. Can you envision this happening with adolescents who are not cognitively impaired, just unable to manage impulses?
Yeah. Francis?
No, so legally, no. The question there is a little bit different in terms of competency. The law has some different standards for understanding the proceedings and understanding communications with one's lawyer. Inability to control one's actions and behaviors or sufficiently control them might play into the mental state that the government has to prove, or then it might be a factor at sentencing, but wouldn't sort of rule someone out of the system altogether at the beginning. And in general, I'd add that the criminal law takes the view that explanation, even really good explanation, is not excuse. Our colleague Stephen Morse at University of Pennsylvania often makes this point, and it's true. And you don't need brain science for the classic example, which is individual's family is starving, breaks into a store, grocery store, to steal bread for the family. That's a great explanation. That's not a criminal excuse. That person is guilty and will be found guilty because they had the requisite mental state and they did the thing that was prohibited. And often that's the case when you have a scientific explanation or a neuroscientific explanation. It might be a great explanation and it might inform sentencing, that is how we respond as a system to this individual, but it probably doesn't relieve someone of their criminal responsibility at all. And all of those cases that the Supreme Court cases I mentioned, it should be emphasized, were about sentencing. So they were all about not was he or she guilty, or are they guilty or not, but once guilty, what can you or can you not do in terms of punishment?
All right, I guess impulse control is sort of something everybody has to some degree. It's a bit of a sliding scale. It'd be difficult. Another Daniel has a question. Are we getting worse policy by advancing understanding of adolescence through judges tweaking the law on a case-by-case basis, steeped in the facts of one case before them, as opposed to instead having a legislative approach that can consider many kinds of defendants at once?
It's a great question, and I think there's some truth to that. So there have been a lot of efforts. I mentioned them, so I'm glad the question came up, and we've studied this a bit in my lab, for state legislatures and for prosecutors working with collaborators to create young adult diversion courts, for instance, which allows for a more systematic approach, either at the state level or at a smaller unit level, say a district attorney or county level. Those solutions are always possible. You know, they run through the typical challenges of any new policy and in the political stream and the trade-offs that have to be made. But I think that's a great question, and I think it's a pretty valid point that state law is criminal law, state law, and it might be well to think about the use of adolescent brain science at that level, which is happening, I should say. It's happening in a lot of states. I don't know, Adriana, have you been involved in some of those state lobbying efforts? Probably have.
Yeah, I have, yeah. And they're always complicated. And I think that also because the use of adolescent science in these court cases is relatively new relative to, you know, the historical use of science in court cases. And so I think we're all just navigating how best to utilize it.
Yeah, I'll just add too that there's a tension between, and well, maybe you sense this, you know, when neuroscientists step out of the lab and into the legislature and become advocates,
yeah,
wearing an advocacy hat requires speaking about neuroscience in a different way. And, you know, you can't, of course, you use all the nuance that you would in your scientific publications. Yeah. And that's just the way it is. But it's challenging because some of the nuances that we're even talking about here, when you have 30 seconds to pitch to a legislature, when you're trying to advocate, you kind of have to set aside, you know, and I think that's a tension. That's just the way it is.
Yeah.
Okay, Jessica requested to hear about sleep in adolescence, and I was wondering, we hear a lot about kids having sleep deprivation these days. Has there been any research cross-referencing that phenomenon with any rise in criminality or conviction, I guess, I don't know, in kids?
I love that question. I want to do that study. Exactly. That is my pet project, to understand that. And I do have a collaboration with a colleague in Texas who is examining how sleep deprivation impacts juveniles who are incarcerated. We know that I can show you beautiful pictures, not beautiful, but telling pictures of how the sleep environment is so distinct in juveniles who are incarcerated from people who are at home. And we know that when we do not get enough sleep, that impacts our emotion regulation, our ability to think about the future, or think about our actions. And it is unsurprising to anyone that sleep problems are associated with mental health. And so if we think about the young people who may be struggling, who may engage in criminal behavior, it's not surprising to think about how sleep may play a role in that. But the empirical study has not yet been done. And I think it's a very important one, because we know adolescents need as much sleep as younger kids do. And yet we don't focus on adolescent sleep.
I would just add that it's not just for adolescents in the justice system. So there's evidence that sleep deprivation and, of course, fatigue generally is problematic for public safety officers, police officers. It's problematic for courtroom officials, including judges. There's some neat evidence on when judges get hungry, how they decide differently. I think it's really, it is quite important. I'd say as well that there are other social factors that really matter. And the patterns of behavior for adolescent antisocial behavior or criminality are, at the group level, are pretty clear. So there are a couple of things. There's this thing called the age crime curve. I didn't have time to show the slide, and you could have shown it too, where
I had it too.
There's almost all crime, kind of like no 5-year-olds are committing crimes, okay?
Right.
And no 95-year-olds are committing crimes, and then it kind of goes up, or in early adolescence it peaks, and then it goes away. It just goes like, so you did nothing in the world. That is just the way that it would work. And then most adolescent crimes happens in groups. Why? Because remember when you were a teenager? That's just how you act. So when you know those things, you can respond socially with our typical social institutions, education being one of them, family structure matters, other social institutions, nonprofits, churches, et cetera. Those are, the motto of our lab is every story is a brain story, but the reason is that we think of those institutions as like brain interventions, someone who is going to an after-school program or goes to church every Sunday, that's a brain intervention. That is a really important brain intervention. So I lump, to me, sleep together with all that other stuff.
Absolutely. And I'll just give one tidbit. We did a study on sleep, and what we found is that the best predictor of brain development in adolescence wasn't how much social media they did before sleep, wasn't academics, it was how comfortable their pillow was. And that is so obvious and important to think about how your sleep environment impacts your sleep quality and impacts then subsequently your ability to learn in the classroom or to regulate your emotions. And so I think we sometimes ignore the very basic needs, which sleep is, and how that impacts our behavior.
Yeah, I'll just add, though, to make a wrinkle and bring it back to, one of the themes that I was raising is that most sleep-deprived kids don't kill others. And so the law still has this challenge of when you get the horrendous crimes and, these explanations, which might, together make sense, are varied. Well, he wasn't sleeping well and it was on drugs. And it's all true. And yet most of most of his friends did all that other wild stuff, but didn't, do these other things. And it's just tough for the law to figure out what was different, about this smaller group of individuals who did really bad things versus the other teenagers who did the normal things.
Who had the same sleep deprivation and peer influence and bad.
Yes, exactly. The law struggles with that. I think the science struggles with that actually also. And by the way, I'd say the mental health struggles with that. Why do some young adults, do certain self-harm and others don't, even though all 10, it's an evolving
confluence of things. And speaking of mental health, there's such a conversation right now about mental health in adolescents, and a lot of it points to social media as the culprit, but it is multifaceted. It's not just social media. It is sleep. It is environment. It is the pandemic. It is climate change. A lot of things that influence how we react to the world.
Okay, that's great. We have another question here from Teddy. says laws affect adolescents and emerging adults beyond criminal law. People under the age of 18 generally don't have the right to make decisions about their own medical care. What does neuroscience have to say about that? And should teenagers have more agency when it comes to medical decisions affecting their own minds and bodies?
I'll jump in quickly and say that if we had had a little more time, I would have given you some other tidbits from that Roper case, in which, in dissent, Justice Scalia said, wait a second, the American Psychological Association has submitted a brief in this Roper case, basically saying that adolescent decision-making is such that it would be cruel and unusual to punish them in this way. But about 10 years before, in a case, Hodgkins v. Minnesota, the same APA offered a brief saying that adolescents had a lot of capacity to make important decisions. That was a case about whether young women could make their own decisions about terminating a pregnancy. And the debate after was, did the APA flip-flop? And exactly the question that was just raised, which is, how can that same adolescent brain, which is being portrayed as so impulsive and can't, control themselves in the cases I mentioned, how does that play out in other, especially not just medical decision cases, but a whole range of other places where adolescents would seem to be able to make their own decisions, have some autonomy. So that's where the law is. The law simply draws lines to different places. I'm wondering, Adriana, what you think about that, because it's the same, well, maybe not the same science. I mean, there are different types of decisions, but there's a range of types of decisions. How do we take all the science you told us in policy making and kind of figure out where to draw these different lines?
Well, Larry Steinberg, who I know is a colleague of both of ours, who's just really wonderful and such a great thinker about adolescence, has written extensively about this, about the idea that when we think about adolescence, sometimes impulsivity comes to mind. And the decisions that are made about health or longer term decisions are made over a longer term, that they're not made impulsively. And that there we know that there's increased capacity in adolescents to think about the future, to kind of reason through the choices that they make. And so that a little bit explains the tension between impulsive decision-making that we may be, more familiar with and attribute to adolescence versus the longer-term thinking through decisions.
Yeah, and I would just say the law is just inconsistent everywhere. Yeah. And in Roper, ultimately what the court did is they drew the line not based on the science. They said basically the science can't tell us where to draw the line. We got to draw it somewhere. 18 is a really good number for a lot of reasons. And it's been the reason that I showed a graph of a bunch of cases where defendants have argued again and again and say, well, I'm 18 in a month, I'm 19, can I get the same protections? Yeah. And the court says, no. Why? Because the line is 18. That's just because, and that's where the line is. Not even if you've got more science, the court says, well, we drew the line at 18, not based on the science, just because. So when you have just because rules, you kind of have to have them sometimes. Like you have to have a voting age, but surely some 16-year-olds are more capable of voting than some who are over 18, but we have a line.
Yeah, well, it's the same with driving. That when you look at driving good driving is an interaction of experience and maturity. And that is so challenging because in most states, age of driving is 16. And so some may argue, well, that's really immature. And that's why we have great laws where you can't have people in the car when you're an 8 or whatever. And some states have moved the driving age to age 18. And they certainly saw less fatalities at age 16. But guess what? They saw an uptick in car accidents and fatalities at age 18 because experience plays a role in these skills. So that's hard to know.
The other place where this is debate is headed right now, I almost pulled these slides, is teenage use of marijuana.
Yeah.
I wonder if you wanted to comment on that. I mean,
I want to hear what you're going to say about it.
Well, I'm going to channel my colleagues who are, even my colleagues who are, left of left, but they're really, really concerned about widespread use, not of marijuana for older adults, but specifically in this critical period of adolescence because of a lot of research showing pretty significant decline in certain cognitive faculties over time.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And this comes back to the age of the adolescent, that the brain is changing, that you can't apply the same principles to the older adult as you do to the adolescent. And so marijuana is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so complicated for the law, though, because, of course, you start saying that and it's like, okay, you have officially become your parents.
I know.
That because another context would say doing that thing could be bad for you, but we trust you to make the right decision. So we're going to allow you to do it, even though we encourage you not to. And that's what a lot of the law, when it comes to this question about decision making, has to do is when are you so concerned about a group as a class that you don't even allow them to make the decision? We don't allow 15-year-olds, we don't allow 13-year-olds to drive, even if they think they're great. We don't even give them the chance. Yes. Later we say, okay, you have the opportunity to drive if you do X, Y, and Z, and you do some training, get a license. And I think we is probably going to be in that middle ground where it's like, well, even once we know some of its detrimental effects, do we say you can't use it at all? Or it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah.
I was just going to make a comment that there was a recent law, I think, or rule that 18-year-olds could drive semis across state lines.
Oh, wow.
I heard that a couple of months ago. I know it was in the news, but and it was kind of controversial. But we have a question that's also related to some of the age line here. How does the difference in sanctions imposed on juvenile offenders affect youth rates of recidivism? For example, when comparing an offender who gets a reduced penalty because they're 17 and another offender gets the full penalty because they're 18 years and 1 day old?
Well, a few things to say. One, our penal system in general for adolescents, for adults, the US system is not great, is one way to phrase it, in terms of reducing, having low recidivism rates. And in this case in particular, it's challenging because at least the cases that I was referencing, the individuals who are not getting these protections are incarcerated essentially for life, or for so long, for 25, 30, 40 years, that that there's not a great comparison or control group. But I do think it's fair to say, given what we do know, that if anything, these extended prison sentences are increasing, depending on how long they are, almost increasing the chance, of, depending on when they get out, of reoffending as opposed to providing treatment. There's a lot of evidence that the way to effectively combat, reduce recidivism, is to be swift, certain, and fair. That is to have penalties quickly, that someone knows are going to be punished, to have them fair, and to know that they're certain. And our system is generally the opposite of that. These extremely long sentences for individuals who might be able to do well with their lives after serving some penalty, for sure. It's not just no penalty. It's just that the extremity of the penalties, which the United States is pretty unique in its extreme length penalties. There's not a connection there to reduce recidivism in general.
Okay, we have a more general question here from Beth saying, how will the brain change regarding anxiety and ADHD from adolescence into adulthood?
Yeah. I do some research on anxiety, and anxiety is really interesting because it fluctuates so much during adolescence. Some of it is normative, and that's the tricky part of anxiety, right? Is that we are sensitive to threats, or we perceive threats in the environment. And the pandemic has really thrown a wrinkle into how we think about anxiety. There are some reports showing that there's an increase in anxiety, but the opposite, increase in depression, decrease in anxiety. And that really highlights the environmental context of that. So young people who were anxious before the pandemic, all of a sudden, a lot of the things that they were anxious about, like going to school or worrying about what other people think about them, wasn't relevant because they were quarantined at home. And so what we know about anxiety is really changing. We know that people, quote, age out of it, as some psychiatrists say, but there's a lot to learn about it.
Okay. Here is somebody, Pamela, saying, I read something about very early development and lack oxytocin production. where when it's stunted by trauma, lack of appropriate coddling, nurturing, or other events, that its potential for production is forever stunted to some extent. Is this true? And how would that oxytocin deficit impact behavior, impulse control, et cetera, in later adolescence?
Francis, do you have anything to say about oxytocin?
I don't have a lot to say about that. It's not something that I've spent much time on.
Yeah, I haven't either, but I will say that hormones, it's just a reminder of how impactful hormones are. I mentioned a little bit about puberty, but it can't go unstated that part of the reason that adolescence is so special is because of the increased pubertal hormones that are released during that time. And oxytocin is certainly one of them that supports social bonding.
Okay. Now here's a question from Steve saying, what is the purpose of sending someone to prison? Is there a role for neuroscience to be brought to bear on helping people who commit crimes to recover and become productive members of society?
The first, I can take a stab at both. So on day one of criminal law, we talk about the purposes of punishment. Traditionally, there are two, which are adopted by most sentencing regimes. One is retribution. That is, you punish someone because they did a bad thing and they get their just deserts. Most people believe in that. To illustrate, the example would be you find someone who participated in the Nazi war crimes, but is now, once you find this person, 85 in a wheelchair and just can never hurt anyone ever again. And in fact, has led a remarkably good life after the horrendous acts earlier in life. Most people want that person punished in some way. That is, they don't want to just let that person go scot-free. However, in the other category, if you're a hardcore utilitarian or consequentialist, you would say we only punish to make the future world better off. That is, we punish for purposes of rehabilitation, for deterrence, future deterrence, and for similar motives. So those two combinations, retributivism and then consequentialism, utilitarianism, are sort of the twin pillars of most sentencing and punishing regimes. Neuroscience has tended to be aligned with the rehabilitation, consequentialism group. Indeed, many philosophers and neuroscientists take the position that we didn't get into this, Adriana, but that we have no free will. Free will is an illusion, and that we are simply, to quote our friends Josh Green and Jonathan Cohen, victims of our neuronal circumstances. We think we're making our choices, like being here today, but we're not. And if that's the world we live in, they would argue, it makes no sense to moralistically punish someone for making a bad choice. Rather, we treat people the way we treat cars, which is you don't let cars with bad brakes stay on the road, but you don't moralize and say, what a bad, evil car. You just fix the brakes. And if you can't fix the brakes, you don't drive the car again. So that's one way neuroscience could change things. The work that we do at the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior is to really draw on the tools of neuroscience and behavioral science. Neuroscience isn't, in my opinion, better than the behavioral sciences. It's a complement. They work together to try and improve individualized treatment and response to reduce recidivism and improve pro-social outcomes. So that's how I would utilize it, but there are others who would blow up the entire system based on neuroscience. I don't know, Adriana, would you blow up the whole system? Are you, do we have free will?
Oh my gosh, that is a whole another conversation that we'll have for another data foundation.
Okay.
Yeah. I was going to ask you how you came to be interested in this. I mean, I know you got your law degree from Harvard, and then you also got a Ph.D. Are these the questions that motivated your interest in what you do now?
I actually got into this because I was studying crime victims, and I chose this to trauma. And I wanted to have a better understanding, which I did, and I was trained in the social sciences, but we had no really connection with the biological sciences, I would say, at all, even at the highest level. It was like so siloed. Yeah. And so I was wondering, just a deep question, why is it so hard to recover from certain trauma?
Yes.
Why can't,
given how resilient the brain is, right? We can recover from so many things. Why not?
And especially after the rest of and I'm putting it in quotes, body is healed. Like the arms work fine. Everything seems to work fine. So why is somebody still so scared or nervous or to the point where they can't, like, what is going on? Yeah. So that took me to the office of Steven Pinker, of all places, a psychologist. He became my dissertation mentor. And obviously put me in touch with the brain science. And then that was my entree. And then once I saw what was happening, I'm like, whoa, everything I'm doing in the law and policy is related to the brain, hence our lab motto and kind of my journey. And then I think I've come back to think that, oh, okay, yes, but the interventions, our brain is so social. Our interventions, I just often use the example of talking. If my students say, what do you do when you have a horrible day? Like your boss was horrible, you go home, you find your friend and you vent. Now your friend can do absolutely nothing about what happened, but you feel better. It's like, what a weird species we are, that the way we handle our worst moments is we just say words back and forth and listen.
Right. Well, that's our superpower. That's what makes us humans, right? Is that we have language in the prefrontal cortex. And so that's what makes us.
So that's wild. To me, I'm like, okay, I just use that in my head. I'm like, all right, if that's the way our brains work, then then no simple violent center or snip this neuron, snip this set of connections or just pop this pill, that it can't, for an organ this complex, the interventions can't be that simple, I guess is kind of where I've come down to. And I think that is a challenge with like our conversation tonight, that sometimes the use of neuroscience and law, to go to the question, feels just like, oh, if you just have the naltrexone, that's the way to handle addiction in the law. Just give me the drug to do. I'm like, no, that it's not, that it can't be that simple. It's part of it though. It's part of it, like better pharmaceuticals, better TMS, electrical stimulation, better cognitive behavior therapy is part of it, but it's not enough. So that's how I got into it.
Or too complex for our own good. Yeah.
But so why did you do anything other than just, you could have had an entire career and never talking to law people?
I know, exactly.
So why do you ever talk to lawyers? Why have you gotten
honestly, it came to me. I was doing research on the adolescent brain and I got emails or contacts about, well, let's think about how that relates to policy. And to be honest, it was a bit intimidating at first because of the conversations we're having now, that it's so complex and it's so hard to pinpoint one-to-one mapping. But I realized that as a scientist, it's a responsibility to think about how our research impacts real world problems and complex problems that don't have a simple answer. And if we can make one bit of change or provide one bit of information that might help it, I find that really exhilarating.
Yeah, I think that's great. I also think it's so important that you all are doing such really high quality science. Larry Steinberg, you mentioned this, Professor Steinberg, I quote him a lot because somebody went to him and said, I'm a scientist. I want to do great science policy. What do you advise? And he said, be a great scientist.
Exactly.
The best way to be a great policy scientist is do great science. And
that's exactly right.
That's really, really important for all the reasons I was saying about the history, where we've had so many, sometimes charlatans and sometimes just overexcited scientists who stopped doing great science because they got so caught up in trying to advance their product or their theory or whatever.
Exactly. That's the best thing we can do. And you never know where your science is going to go. And that's kind of the beauty of science and the slow going part of science. But it's fun to be able to have conversations about this based on science that I did without realizing it was going to be important.
Yeah, this has been cool. It's also nice we met when younger in our careers.
I know, so, way younger.
Yeah, I know. So this is pretty cool that our fields have sort of taken off. I did not know if the field would take off. I
know, it has.
It's been neat.
Yeah. Do you both have time for a couple more questions, or?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Here's one from Cesar. Can you take into account psychopathy and sociopathy in development?
Well, I think it's always a consideration, but similar to something Francis said earlier, that you can't equate development or, quote, not having achieved the maturational state that, we consider adults to be associated with psychopathy. And so it's challenging, and it depends. Same as with everything else. Psychopathy is very varied. And so it really depends on what specifically you're talking about.
Okay. Anusayab has a question. Some of the impulsive propensities of adolescents seem similar to adults with ADD. Has ADD ever been used successfully to change sentencing in court? If so, to what extent does self-awareness matter? I.e., if there's evidence, I know I have impulse control issues, but don't take medication, does that count against me?
Interesting.
So at criminal sentencing, let me give some context. not all systems are like this, but in the United States system, which all of my examples tonight have come from, I should add that across the international spectrum, the use of neuroscience in law looks different, and that's for a whole nother day. And but it's just important to know. But in the U.S. context, we bifurcate the guilt phase from the sentencing phase. The guilt phase is what it ends with if there's a jury, we the jury find the defendant guilty or not guilty. The sentencing phase in the U.S. is typically done by a judge. There are a couple of exceptions, like in a capital case when the death penalty, then jury will decide. And the judge has pretty free rein to consider just about anything in determining the sentence. Now, there are guidelines they have to follow. There are certain boxes for certain states or federal system. But within those boxes, there's leeway, and they can consider all types of evidence. This is why maybe someone in the audience have done this before. I've done it for someone. They ran into the problem with the law, and they asked you for a character letter where you wrote and basically said, oh, so-and-so is a good person. They just made a dumb mistake. Please go easy on them. And I mention that because it does not have to be the type of scientific evidence that would be required at admissible at guilt phase. The sentencing phase, you can consider a bunch, which is a long way to say, yes, you can consider things such as what was happening to the individual at that time, what is the individual pledged to do differently, and there's usually, it's called a pre-sentence report, where the probation parole officers will meet with the individual and recommend to the judge a plan of action. And often that the first offense would not typically involve incarceration if it's not a major offense and a non-violent offense. So not just ADD, but other types of mental health issues can certainly play a role in sentencing. And not just in mitigating, but in finding a sentence that hopefully is aligned with what will be in the best interest of the individual and society, than the society that the government is trying to protect from the behaviors that might have been problematic.
Okay, this is somewhat related here to the last question. What is the long-term impact of ADHD medicine on the adolescent brain?
We don't know. So I hate to give that answer, but the truth is that we have only had the benefit of brain imaging studies for a few years, and it's hard to track that information over time and to determine whether or not there is a long-term outcome. So we don't know.
Okay. Oh, I have a comment from Brendan, who says, reminding you to put your link to your slides in the chat.
Oh, sure. Yeah, we will.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Has there been research into the impact of neurodevelopmental disorders, independent of intellectual disabilities, on the timeline of adolescent brain development? And then what about the combined impact of neurodevelopmental disorders and complex trauma in adolescent brains, especially when it comes to pain/reward centers and impulse control?
There's a little bit of research on that, but not enough to be conclusive, in part because the sample sizes are quite small. And so it's hard to get a definitive conclusion about that. But I know that there is growing interest in answering this question.
Okay. This person says, I'm fascinated about the broken brain. It seems like the same can be said about dementia. Not every case of dementia is the same, and not all adolescents with broken brain are the same. Okay. Bama has a question, thought-provoking. Should we rethink the composition of the jury and include adolescents in the group when an adolescent is being judged, so they could provide insights from teens' perspective?
There are some jurisdictions that have experimented with just that. It's a peer jury, and they do it for a very select kind of smaller, lower level crime, but they picked up on just that intuition that you sort of need peers to understand, and it's very limited in when it's been used, but at least somebody's tried it. And I don't know what the results were. I haven't followed it closely enough to check out, but it's an interesting idea for sure.
I'm not sure how much longer you guys have, but here's one that says, what are the main types of experiments that yield conclusions about what brain function gets developed at what specific stage in life?
That's really interesting. So I mentioned a little bit that basic functions like motor development or language development happen earlier in life, whereas more what's called higher cognitive development happens later in life, like social development or thinking about the future. Those things happen during the adolescent years. And so the brain follows this kind of back to front development where these functions occur. So it is interesting that our brains have developed this developmental stage of development.
Okay, I feel like we've really overwhelmed you with these questions. If you guys have any concluding comments you'd like to make?
No, other than that, this is an exciting intersection of law and psychology and neuroscience, and focusing in on the adolescent brain is so important because, as Frances mentioned, I think we each get asked a lot about, tell me exactly when adolescent is an adult. And that's a difficult question to answer because we have to first define what we mean by adolescence and what it means to be an adult.
Right, a lot of work to be done.
Yeah.
And how about you, Frances? Any concluding thoughts?
Yeah, no, oh, sorry. Yeah, no other comments other than say thank you and great questions from the audience. And this was a lot of fun.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Adriana Galván and Frances Shen, both for coming on and sharing your expertise and interacting so wonderfully and giving us all this food for thought. And we want to thank, of course, the Dana Foundation for facilitating this and making this happen.
Thank you. Well, it was really fun. It was nice to see you, Frances.
Yeah, nice to see you too. Have a good night, everybody.
Okay, bye.